Hello and welcome back for another episode of our Intrepid Adventures in Space with the ARC. Last episode we got a contract to help a poor soul lost in orbit, and with our new parts, it's high time we help them out. Over in the VAB, I got to work right away on a two-seater craft with enough fuel to get into orbit and do some maneuvering. This design is worth looking at in a bit more detail since it's the first craft I've made in this series to utilize the fuel line parts. At launch, all three of the lower stage engines on the right are firing, providing a reasonable thrust-to-weight ratio at launch, which rises somewhat more gently than crafts utilizing solid rocket boosters. However, the center stage is designed to operate as a good kicker stage on its own thanks to the gimbaling of the swivel engine. This is done by leveraging the new fuel line parts alongside these radial liquid fuel tanks, such that the center engine effectively runs only off of the side tank fuel until the side boosters are depleted and decoupled. After the center stage is decoupled, about 1200 meters per second of delta V should be needed from the upper stage to complete the orbital insertion, leaving quite a respectable amount over for the rendezvous maneuvering. Before the launch, we time warp a bit in the hopes that our orbital retriever craft will be as close as possible to the target before any maneuvers are even conducted. On launch, the craft has a TWR of just under 1.5. However, the gravity turn parameters are slightly more conservative due to the slower rise in TWR of this craft. Solid-fueled boosters lose a lot more of their mass more quickly since they're a glorified tube full of burny stuff. The liquid-fueled stages have more dry mass, particularly due to the engine. Since the fuel lines are doing their work, when the side boosters are decoupled, the craft has a full tank with just shy of 2,000 meters per second worth of fuel in the center stage. Once we're in orbit, we're slightly behind the target, so we'll have to make the orbital period of our ship faster than that of the target in order to catch up. I started planning some maneuvers for the rendezvous by changing into the Target Kerbin Orbit Reference Frame, aka Target KO. This works very similar to the Minmus Kerbin Orbit Reference Frame I went a bit more into detail about last episode, where what we're seeing is what the orbit would look like if we pinned both the target vessel and Kerbin in place. This rendezvous is a bit tricky because the target vessel's periapsis is actually in the atmosphere, so we don't want to make our point of contact near the target's periapsis. The complete flight plan can, however, still be conducted in two maneuvers. Generally speaking, you would want to do a first maneuver to create a point of contact where the orbits meet. I normally like to aim for the periapsis or apoapsis of the target vessel, but in this case it's just an arbitrary point somewhere in between. The second maneuver occurs at this contact point and is used to change the period of your vessel's orbit so that the two crafts meet at the contact point you previously created. I find that the Target KO reference frame makes this even easier to do than in the stock game, because you can see from the coiling elliptical path how many orbits it will take to rendezvous, and you can simply do a maneuver to move the orbit line from the next closest pass around, such that your close encounter is created. Try to compare the shape of the orbit displayed here after the second maneuver with where the target vessel is relative to our craft once the chase cam is enabled. After a few passes around Kerbin, we eventually meet up with our sullen compatriot. and after a bit of sloppy engine burns, we managed to park up next to the little capsule so that Hilfrod, a new engineer, can hop, skip, and jump over to our pod to come home. Entry for these spherical pods goes alright from low Kerbin orbit, but this landing was still quite hairy given the altitude and slope of the landing site. These parachutes are still set to too high of a pressure threshold for pre-deployment, which became a genuine problem landing on top of a mountain. On landing, I had Hilfrod get out to collect some quick science from the arid highlands, and was rudely reminded of why you should always F5 for safety. The physics wagged out, probably due to the slope, and Hilfrod imploded into a cloud of dust. Luckily, the persistent save recorded right after the pod landed. I could have been out either a Kerbal or a chunk of my time otherwise. After an apparently perilous EVA, Hilfrod headed back into the ship, and I immediately went to the tracking station to unload the vessel while the crew report completed. With our new friend saved and our contract completed, I set out to work on the other objective I had set for myself last episode, which was to send a SCAN Sat out to Minmus to hopefully get some data to help with our manned landing, as well as generate some science points. I ended up using a very similar design to this previous craft for the satellite, using the liquid side boosters and fuel lines for the launch stage. For the scans to collect all of the best resolution data they can provide, both of the scanners on this craft need to operate at an altitude of 105 kilometers. Since this is considered high space over Minmus, it is a great craft on which to put a sight experiment to slowly collect data from every biome. Once the craft was in orbit, I set up another Minmus transfer, but this time with some precise corrections so that the satellite ended up in an orbit with an inclination just above 88 degrees. Once we're in space around Minmus, we can capture the craft in orbit and enable our scanners. This is a good example of how the surface-oriented reference frames I talked about last episode work. You can see as the steps in the simulation increase, the satellite slowly corkscrews around the planet. Even though the orbit of the spacecraft with respect to the stars is staying the same, the moon slowly rotating underneath it results in this twisty shape where the satellite is eventually able to scan all of the body's surface. Unfortunately, this satellite is kinda crappy. It's really just the solar panels, so there's just never enough power to keep the scanners running constantly, even on the day side of the orbit. As a result, I did time warp for a while to try to collect data, but it was painfully slow. I eventually decided that I would have to move on and do something to pass the time while the rest of the data trickled in, so I went to see what Mission Control had on offer. As it happened, there were 3 more contracts to rescue some Kerbals from low orbit, and I decided to snatch them up to make a good use of the craft we just designed. The procedure will be the same as the first rescue mission, but thankfully this time none of the crafts have orbits dipping into the atmosphere. Launch the craft, match up the periapsis or apoapsis depending on whether we need to catch up to or fall back to the target, and do a second maneuver to create an intercept. I won't bother you with every little detail 3 more times, so I'll show them in sequence here and see you on the other side. Once all of the contracts were finished, we ended up with 95 science points. Even though the contracts didn't really take enough time for the ScanSat to send back more data, they did provide some opportunities to land in new biomes and collect surface samples as well as crew and EVA reports. These reports from our homeworld don't provide a lot of science points, but they still help given that we're at a point where most of the techs we're aiming for cost 90 points. 90 science points is enough to unlock a very important new tech, heavy rocketry. This tech pairs with the larger fuel tanks we unlocked last time and gives us larger, more powerful engines. More thrust means more capable rockets, and hopefully with these new parts we'll be able to work a little magic next episode and send the Aerospace Research Collective to new heights.